Hello, and I welcome all the participants on behalf of Dheer and Dheer Associates, a full service law firm in India. We thank you all for joining us for the webinar from across the world. I am KPS Kohli, partner Dheer and Dheer Associates, and I will be your moderator for today. First, some housekeeping instructions. You all are aware that the webinar is divided in two sessions of 1 hour each, and I have excellent set of panelists for both the sessions. Many participants have asked some intriguing questions at the time of registration. I will take up those questions with the panelists during the sessions. However, I will encourage all participants to put their questions in the Q&A window below. At the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A round. I will try and take up as many questions as we can. We will seek feedback at the end of the webinar, and I would request the panelists to spare a minute to fill the same. Now on the topics. The first session is decoding the insolvency and bankruptcy code, tackling challenges in India's changing economic scenario. And the second session is impact of COVID-19 on businesses. In my view, there is hardly any economic activity that is not affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the businesses, and especially the MSME sector, has been viciously affected. In these testing times, both the creditors and the debtors are looking for ways to avert the inevitable, that is the financial trauma that the pandemic has brought. While homebound, I chanced upon a letter dated 13th of March 1867 by an American debtor to Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, who had opposed the bankruptcy law passed by the Congress in 1867, creating the first uniform bankruptcy law by the United States. The bankruptcy bill was passed in view of the exigencies created by the Civil War, with virtual shutting down of the economy, as presently is the case with COVID. The bankruptcy, in the letter, the debtor, while articulating his wishes that the government go even further stated, and I quote, bankruptcy law is a relief, unquote. With probably the youngest bankruptcy code in the world, and during this short lifespan, we have seen many amendments either on account of change in circumstances or by learning. There have been amendments in the bankruptcy code in view of COVID-19, and before I dwell into the same, I would like to introduce my illustrious panel. And my first panelist is Mr. Sachin Gupta, who heads the corporate and litigation dispute practice in the firm as a senior partner, with prime focus on complex civil and commercial litigation and arbitration matters. He's graduated as an engineer and thereafter completed his degree in law. His areas of practice are rehabilitation of distressed entities, shareholders dispute, recovery of debts and securitization related matters, bidding and commercial disputes, amalgamation and restructuring of companies. He provides consultancy and strategic advice to clients to manage their litigations. He has successfully led various litigations involving shareholders dispute, white collar crimes and writ litigation. My second panelist is Varsha Banerjee, who's a partner and has been in practice for past 11 years. She represents corporate entities and institutional creditors, shareholders, investors, and large lender groups or entities in insolvency matters, major debt restructurings, and asset sale transactions. She focuses her litigation practice on corporate restructuring and insolvency matters, recovery of debts and commercial disputes, civil suits, and arbitration. She regularly appears before various judicial, quasi-judicial authorities in the country, including the Supreme Court of India, various high courts, and the NCLTs, and of course the NCLAT. She represents clients on liquidation processes and related aspects of insolvency and restructuring law. My third panelist is Ashish Pyasi, who is an associate partner with Dheer and Dheer Associates practicing in Mumbai. He's also a company secretary. He's a leading lawyer having vast experience in dispute resolution and insolvency and bankruptcy laws. He has represented clients in various large litigations, including some of the widely reported ones. And my last panelist is based in our Hyderabad office. Amir Bhavani is a principal associate in the firm. He is a postgraduate in MBA and also LLM from Osmania University. His core expertise lies in dispute resolution, especially involving Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016, banking laws, and general corporate. He regularly appears before various judicial, quasi-judicial authorities, including high courts, debt recovery tribunals, and national company law tribunals. He advises large number of companies, creditors, other stakeholders in identifying and adopting most suitable approach and devise legal strategies to effectively deal with the aspects of corporate insolvency and restructuring. With this, I welcome all my participants, all my panelists. And my first question is to Sachin on the journey of IBC. How effective IBC has been in resolving the situation of creditors having exposure in financially distressed entities. Are the creditors favorably situated as regards recovery under the IBC regime?
Thank you, KPS, for giving an introduction to all of us. And as far as the question is concerned, we have the law which is it's very nascent stage. 4 years into a new code, the code has been seeing changes, amendments. I think in the last 4 years, the number of amendments that we have seen in this code has not happened in any act in India so far. When this act came, everyone thought that this would be a boom. It could lead to recoveries for all the financial creditors. The NPA issue of the country would be finished. The banks will get their money and all sort of things. But 4 years down the line, the situation I feel that the situation is not so encouraging. If you look at the figures of as on 31st December of 2019, 3,300 cases have been admitted to IBC, out of which around 400 cases were withdrawn on settlements. Only 190 cases have seen resolution, and 780 cases have gone into liquidation. So the idea that IBC would resolve an asset or revive the asset, the figures don't say that way. 190 out of 3,300 is a figure which is very, very less. And if we talk on numbers on recovery basis, the approximately 8 lakh crores of debts were admitted for under IBC in these matters, in which resolution and liquidation have taken place. And we have a recovery of 1.5 lakhs under the matters which are under CRP, and and which is around 43% of the amount, and 1.6 and 21,240 crores only in liquidation. This is around 5% of the total debts admitted. So the figures are very bleak. There are a lot of haircuts. The operational creditors have suffered in most of the matters. The financial creditors have taken a big hit. The statutory dues have been written off. Yes, the recovery percentage has increased. But I don't know whether I would say it has been very successful. Let's see how it pans out in a year or two, and then we can exactly really say whether IBC has been a successful law, or is it just another one of its kinds like the SARFAESI and the RDDB, which had come with a bang and fizzled out.
Right. So what's your take, Varsha? What's your take on this? Whether the insolvency has it benefited creditors?
Thanks, KP. Now that figures have been stated and we can't do much, whatever are the figures are the factual reality as we may say. But when we talk about IBC and the journey of IBC, we need to see it in the context of the earlier regimes that were applicable. So if I compare it with the earlier law which was there, principally we had a SICA which evidently failed for a very long time. The companies were stuck, the creditors were stuck, the promoters somehow controlled the entire process. So we had that as a recovery mechanism or a bankruptcy provision. Then we had the SARFAESI Act. Then we have the RDDB Act, again suits which are very time consuming process. So all those things were there till that point of time, till the time IBC came. Yes, a lot was thought about IBC and it was assumed that maybe IBC will come as a magic wand and just solve the problems of all the creditors, principally on the basis that this was the first regime which gave the creditors the possession. The creditors were made the whole and sole person to take over the company and deal with the company at the threshold stage. At the admission stage itself, the COC comes into the picture and they take over the entire thing. Probably that was looked into as a very new feature and a relevant feature which will take IBC to a different level and help creditors gain a lot. But when we talk about the benefit to the creditor or the recovery proceeding of the creditor, we need to understand and evaluate the other situation. What is the value of the asset? Can the company be revived or not? Is a resolution possible, or is it better to go for liquidation? All these things have to be comprehensively analyzed to understand and come to a conclusion that whether IBC is a success, whether IBC is a success for the creditors or not. I definitely feel that the rate of recovery or the speed which IBC has, a specific timeline was introduced for the first time in our Indian legislation, which was adhered to a large extent. We have provisions in CPC, everything, order should come in so many days, proceedings should be culminated in so many days. But IBC, the statutory time frame for completing of the process, whether 180 days or 270 days, and now the threshold of 330 days, have been followed in more or less most of the matters, other than few matters which for other circumstances and other reasons had to go on longer duration of time. So if I compare it from where India was maybe 2 decades earlier to where India is as on date, I feel yes, it's a progress, but the journey is there, a lot needs to be done, and the economic scenario, the present circumstance and all will definitely pay important, and it will have a this will be an important chapter in the growth of IBC, I feel, because the economy is at the lowest possible position as on date, and not only in India, it's world over. So therefore this impact will be a very crucial thing which we'll have to see how it pans out, what happens. Creditors have to be pragmatic in their approach to ultimately come to a stage where it's beneficial for all and the object and purpose of the code is met.
Right. So I think we already have seen the figures from Sachin and Varsha for all efficiency of the IBC code. Coming to Ashish, what's your view on this? Is IBC beneficial for the creditors?
Hello everyone. KP, just to add to what other panelists have already said, the one good thing about IBC is right now is that the COC, the creditors are having complete control over the process, which is a very good sign. But at what cost? Speed has come, but whether the recoveries are happening or not is something which we need to check. And probably down the line, I'm sure government has come up with so many resolution, has thought about this. There are so many amendments also in this journey so far. But yet we have not seen those good results with which this law was promulgated. And the idea is that the recovery should also improve. Ultimately, today, if a creditor is coming and filing a petition, he has to see to it that he gets his money also out of the account. Now, whether that is happening or not, the numbers are very clear. The panelists have already discussed. In comparison to the other laws which were there, today also they are existing, but in that sense, even the RBI data says that it is better than, the recovery is better than the SARFAESI Act as of now, but
right,
not so promising at the same time.
Right, but at least one proof from you that creditors are now in control of the proceedings.
Yes.
Quickly, Amir, what's your take on this?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so KP, I believe that IBC is a gift to the creditors. Like with it being a time-bound process, it has also inculcated a sense of responsibility among the debtors. Now they are very cautious in their decision-making. Of course, we had teething problems, and we do have at the moment teething problems. And I would say that the IBC has got a very long infancy period. And creditors driven mechanism, as all the panelists have said, it has brought in a change into the mind of the companies when it comes to the concepts of borrowing and timely repayment. So I would say it has 100% be a gift to the creditors.
Great. So that's Amir is all in favor of this. But my next question is to Ashish. IBC is in force for about more than 3 years. And in its fourth year, we see that initiation of the proceedings under the code are likely to be kept in abeyance for about 6 months to 1 year. How do you view this proposed amendment? And what are the other avenues, scenarios available to the creditors if it does comes in?
So, since it is at the stage of discussion, in fact, last news which came was that the cabinet has approved this proposal of suspending some of the provisions of the IBC. But the final details are yet to come. And once we'll get those final details, we'll come to know what is the effect it will have, whether it is going to affect only the new petitions which can be or cannot be filed, whether it will also affect the petitions which are filed for the default which occurred earlier, or it is going to affect only the period. If there is a cutoff date is also given, then whether it is going to touch upon only the limited aspect of it. Say the defaults which are arising, say from 1st of March, say till the time lockdown gets over. So these are the things which are yet to be seen. Now, considering if it is, if the provisions are put in abeyance for say 6 months to 1 year. Now, some of the creditors can wait and watch also. It's one of the options which is available, because if they opt for other remedies, may not be so expeditious also. So the speed is something which we are looking at, and that's the reason why IBC was promulgated. Now, if you look at the scenarios which are available to them, the old methods, including filing suit, proceeding under arbitration also, and then opting for DRT proceedings, SARFAESI action also. We have seen a couple of actions wherein the management was taken over. In fact, we have advised, in one matter, Mr. Gupta will be in a better position to explain, because he was leading in that, and it was one of the successful, change of management. So there are other means which are available to traders. They can offer them, and it's not an end. Of course, it is just an advance for just probably 6 months. But I would suggest not all the provisions should be put in advance, because if we see, say for example, Section 10 application, wherein the corporate debtor itself goes to the NCLT to get the resolution of its financial stress, I believe that should not be stopped, because it will affect them adversely. Today, if a promoter or the director or the management knows it very well that they'll not be in a position to run the company, then why not they should be allowed to get a resolution done where the maximization of value will happen. Today, probably a couple of leakages may be also stopped in that process. So I believe Section 10 is something which should not be stopped right now, should not be in abeyance. And other provisions, considering the situation, may be put in abeyance.
Right. And what's your view, Sachin sir, on the putting in abeyance the proposed amendment? What's your view on this?
I think Ashish has very rightly said that we have to wait and see what actually the ordinance comes. Whether they take a cutoff date of 29th Feb and forward, or it says no IBC petitions under 7, 9, and 10 for the next 6 months. So that clarity has to be seen, but I feel it should be for any defaults after 1st of March. There should not be a petition. Now you can't, ask someone in a matter where the default has already been a year old that you can't file today. So that would not be correct, but let's see what the government finally comes, the ordinance comes out. Now, as far as the other options, the banks will, I think, start looking more meaningfully at one-time settlements with the promoters. I think that would take a precedence over other recovery matters if it is possible. And then obviously we have the old RDDB Act where they file an OA, a kind of a suit for recovery of the dues and goes into execution. Or under a SARFAESI where take over the possession of the asset and sell the asset. Interestingly, if you see the section 13(4)(b) of SARFAESI, where a creditor has a right to take over the management of the company, appoint its own directors, and run the company in a professional way, and make its debt to be repaid. Now, that process is akin to what I would say is the CRP process, because here RP takes over. The creditors control the RP through the COC, and he runs the company, and then may, invites for people to buy the company or step in and to revive the company. Now, and that entire thing can be done in 13(4)(b) because the shareholders become redundant, the directors become redundant, the secured creditor takes over the company, and he is able to run the company till his dues are paid. So the financial creditors may look at that option and try and see if it is possible and akin to CIRP, but another process which has not yet been tried in India. On number of cases, only one case has been done and successfully done, where change of management took place, and the entity which took over, the creditor which took over, ran the company very well for 3 years. Thereafter, it was taken over by another company. So I think the banks will have to relook at the options they had, and maybe one-time settlement with the borrower is another option that they may fall back on.
The 13(4) B being on the statute book for almost 2 decades, and still there's been one case. So I'm sure with this, people will start looking at law books again. But my next question is on the amendment that has come up. On the recent amendment that has come up, and the rationale for increasing the default limit for initiation of the kicking of the code from 1 lakh to 1 crore. Do you think it is beneficial for everyone, and especially for the MSME sector?
There are 2 points, 2 things that I have to see. They have increased it from 1 lakh to 1 crore. Now, whether it'll have a retrospective effect or a prospective effect, that is not clear. There are a lot of matters which are pending, not yet admitted, where the operational creditor matters, the default amount is less than 1 crore. Now, what would NCLT do with these matters? They'll say they'll be dismissed because now the default amount has been increased. So that is a point which has not been clarified in the ordinance that has come. So this would lead to a lot of litigation, because the NCLT may take a view that we will dismiss these petitions, and until it is decided whether this ordinance is retrospective or prospective, I don't know how it will be taken up. The other thing is, since the new ordinance which is going to come up, which suspends any initiation of any petition under IBC for the next 6 months to 1 year. So for the new petitions, this default amount will become redundant till a new petition has to be filed. Whereas this increase in amount was only thought of to save MSMEs and smaller industry, where the default amounts may not be very large, so they raise the limits to 1 crore. So no IBC petitions could be filed against these entities. But on the other hand, what they have not thought of, I think, is these MSMEs or small companies, the outstanding that they have to take from other people are also small. So you, at one point, you may say no IBC petitions against them, but also at the other point, they are not able to file any IBC petitions against anyone who is not paid to them. So I don't know how this would really be beneficial, or whether it will really be beneficial, or the objective would be beneficial, because this I see would lead to a lot of litigation on the pending matters. And in the future matters of the MSMEs and the small companies which they are trying to protect may have lost a tool of recovery, or getting their money. So we'll have to see and wait and watch the actual impact of this ordinance.
Right. And Ashish, since you practice in Mumbai, the financial capital, what's your take? Do you think that this increase of limit is beneficial to everyone?
I believe yes, and I have some reason and different aspect also to it, because though initially it was when finance minister announced this, that it will be for the benefit of the MSME sector, but I believe it is going to help everyone, because I have personally seen a couple of cases in Mumbai NCLT itself, that wherein the financial creditors are supporting, but the operational creditors, where the debt amount is small, but then they are coming and filing the petitions just to get the recovery done at the earliest. Now this is also results into a leakage in the business cycle, the credit cycle which a company would have. So it is going to help them also, because not everyone will be in a position to use that as a threat. If it's a big amount, then yes, if it's a good case, NCLT will also be proactive in deciding such matters. But from debtors' perspective, and also even the financial creditors, because in fact I have seen where the ICA has been entered into. There were a couple of cases wherein the ICA was entered into and operational creditors were signed, because there was no binding either order or any scheme which has been formed for the operational creditors. They were coming and filing petitions in NCLT, and the effect was such that every time the financial creditors were coming in, and then they were suggesting that this petition should not be admitted. But the NCL team has to just look into the two aspects, whether there is a debt in default. Now, with the increase in the default limit, probably it will help those cases as well. So I believe it is going to help everyone.
Right. On the next question, that is to Varsha, regarding the resolution, time and again, we have seen that resolution takes precedence over liquidation. But in insolvency laws, don't you think that balance is to be maintained of the two approaches? And how far do you think IBC has been able to achieve that balance?
So when we talk about IBC, actually, Supreme Court in n number of judgments has principally said that resolution is the main bedrock on which IBC is based upon. Though this probably comes from the socialistic mindset or the socialism part in our constitution, which says that we need to give employment to maximum number of people. We need to ensure that a company remains a going concern, and all such thoughts are considered as a noble or a benevolent thought rather than going in for a liquidation. Because let us understand what is liquidation. Liquidation is definitely a part of the insolvency regime. What transpires in liquidation process is that the asset of the company is actually sold off at an appropriate time for the maximum possible value, which benefits all stakeholders. So if this critical element of time is lost by anybody, then the asset depletes. The value which the asset had, say, as on February 2020, will definitely go down, and the diminishing in value will start happening. So I don't know what is the reason for seeking viewing liquidation with a different glass, if I may use the word, when we talk about the insolvency regime, and so much of precedence and prominence being raised on the aspect of resolution. Though resolution is definitely something which everybody attempts to. The first intent of the COC is also to resolve the company. Of all stakeholders, shareholders, employees, workers, everybody wants the company to resolve. Because if the company is resolved, it remains, it's a going concern, the government also earns, the exchequer earns, everybody earns, so it's a win-win situation for all. But there are cases and there are instances in which liquidation is probably a way better approach than resolution. Resolution can ultimately even fail, assuming even after 1 year, after 2 years. Even in the case of dirty dozens also, we have seen some resolution applicants backing out subsequently or failing to perform their obligations. Or even in other matters, it's a matter of fact that the approved resolution plan thereafter is not implemented. Then what happens? In the interregnum, we again waste, say, from anywhere between 3 months to 2 years, and again we are back at square one. And the asset which probably could have been sold in February 2020 will eventually be sold in February of 2022, thereby doing what? Putting strain on everybody, resolution professional, even the adjudicating authorities, then the workers, employees, creditors, everybody. So we have to see that liquidation is definitely a part of the insolvency law, and there may be case appropriate scenarios where liquidation is the right call. And IBC has also been amended now, which says that the creditors, even within 180 days, can decide, look, there is no future of this company, so let us go for resolution. So whatever is the residual value, we realize that residual value, and that too in this shortest possible time, because time is essence, that all of us have understood. With time, the value of the asset depletes. So that is the thing, and we definitely need to balance and look favorably towards liquidation in a case appropriate situation.
Right. So Varsha is all at timely liquidation in any appropriate matter. So Ashish, what is your take on it? Since you practice in Mumbai, and of course, there's always been some change in perspective from a socialist school to or a capitalist school. So what is your view, and how do you think NCLT Mumbai has been looking at it, at liquidations, especially?
So recently, in isolation for Russia, because the ultimate goal, because liquidation is something which is a last resort. That is the time you should offer liquidation. But instead, that case, in that yes, it's not worth taking the process further. And as Varsha also mentioned, that in a case, the COC can decide on liquidation or resolution that even before 180 and NCT is bound. But in Mumbai, my own experience is that there are a couple of cases where the NCT has informed the COC members to understand what is the reasoning why they are getting into it. Of course, people may have a different view as to there are a couple of judgments on the commercial wisdom also, that it's ultimately it's the commercial wisdom of the COC why we should get into that aspect altogether. But what we have seen is that there are change in mind also, change in heart also, I would say, because ultimately it's a commercial call which is to be taken by the bankers. But there are cases where the decision was revised also. So this is something which is depends on case to case. If there is a company which is not buying us, as Varsha also said that probably next 2 years we may not be able to acquire. If we have only the plant and machinery, and there are
Ashish,
other
I think
businesses
we
going
are
on,
losing you
it can be
on
a
the
business.
audio. I think we are losing you on the audio, but I do get your essence where you have said that liquidation probably will have to pursue the bench and make them understand that what is the commercial wisdom behind it. And obviously the reasoning why liquidation should be preferred over resolution in certain cases. On in fact commercial wisdom, there is one issue that comes up very repeatedly, and I want Amir to address it for me on the commercial wisdom of the COC members. So it has been held that the COC is the ultimate litmus test for approval of any resolution plan. So are there any safeguards and legal issues involved while exercising such commercial wisdom by the COC?
Yeah, so basically, first we need to understand the meaning of wisdom. Meaning of wisdom is the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. It's a fact of being based on sensible and wise thinking. Now, we need to first ask ourselves a question. Are the members of the COC better placed to take a commercial decision, which is a balance between two major or key aspects, I would say. One being the value maximization, and second being to consider the interest of all the stakeholders, including that of the operational creditors. Like while we all know that in the case of case Sachidhar versus Indian Overseas Bank, the Supreme Court has categorically stated that under IBC, the commercial wisdom of the COC has been given the paramount status. Now it is noteworthy that when the IBC was introduced, no specific requirement was enshrined under the code for either recording either the approval or the rejection of the resolution plan. It was only with an amendment which effect from July 2018, this aspect was given the effect. Now, while re-emphasizing the case Sachidhar's judgment, the Honorable Supreme Court in SR Steel's judgment has given some legal issues and safeguards, which are like the first is the viability of the corporate debtor itself. Like in the industry, the corporate debtor is situated, is it viable or not? Then the commercial feasibility of the proposed resolution plan and the maximization of value of the assets of the corporate debtor coupled with it adequately balancing between all the stakeholders. Now, very interestingly, imagine a situation where COC has approved the plan which is lower than the liquidation value. Can we call it as a commercial wisdom? Also, this raises a very good question upon the main purpose of the act, which is the value maximization. To sum up, I would just say that these are the guidelines which are given by the Honorable Supreme Court, but we are at a stage where COC needs to fully understand the meaning of commercial wisdom, that the approved plan is to be tested on the standpoint of the value maximization along with the adequate balanced interest of all the stakeholders.
Right. Quickly, Ashish, what's your take? You have been advising both the creditors, the COC committees, and also the debtors. So, what's your take? What should be the safeguards that they should ensure?
Ultimately, as I said, is ultimate control in that process in that sense. That responsibility. So they are exercising that right and the responsibility which is there.
Ashish, I think we have lost Ashish. So Sachin sir, do you want to probably shed some light on it?
Am I audible now?
I think we've lost both.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are, but I
Am
think
I
there is some.
audible?
Yes, you are. There is some disturbance. Ashish, I'll come back to you on this a little later. In fact, I want to ask Varsha on the. I mean, code is not probably you will say the IBC is not a recovery mechanism. However, the rights of the secured creditors who have been kept at bay by ingenious promoters, and you talked about the older regime where the debtors were in control, and it has and they have adversely impacted the interpretation regarding the rights and the provisions rights of the creditors and the provisions of the Limitation Act by the Honorable Supreme Court's judgment. So I think that the latest judgment has dampened the spirits under the code and in fact dilutes the essence of IBC in terms of getting a timely resolution for all the matters.
Yes, I definitely think that what has transpired from the reading of all these Supreme Court judgments is that for the purposes of initiating or triggering, if I may use the word, any proceedings under the code, critical element is the claim or the amount of default should be within the period of the limitation. Now, when we talk about period of limitation, what is there is the date on which the default arose, and from that date of default, if they are reading article 137 to say within the period of 3 years from date of default, you need to approach the adjudicating authority by filing a section 7 petition. So if that period of 3 years has gone by, then you are no longer entitled to approach the NCLT, which is actually for my benefit. So now, which is the category of creditor which is getting impacted negatively by this particular interpretation the most is secured creditors. So when we talk about secured creditors, they are creditors having security interest over the asset of the company. Ordinarily, such security interests are in form of mortgages. So mortgage, as we all understand, has a period of 12 years as a limitation period under the Indian Limitation Act. But now what is happening for these creditors in this proceedings of IBC is that they are saying ki no, the default took place way back whenever it took place, assuming I'll put a default which took place 5 years before coming into force of IBC. So they are saying no, it took place 5 years before coming into force of the IBC. You have filed an OA before the concerned DRT under RDDB Act, and there is a decree also in the OA. Here, decree has been passed. The decree says yes, the company is liable to pay say X rupees to this particular creditor along with interest. The debt remains in the balance sheet of the company. The debt is clearly admitted, adjudicated, decreed in favor of the creditor. But still, such a creditor is not entitled to approach the NCLT under IBC and take any recovery action. Why? Because the logic or the applicable law as on date is that ki no, decree is the culmination of your cause of action which accrued way back 5 years before. So therefore, the culmination of a decree does not give you a right of limitation. The limitation has to run from the date of default. So this is very interesting in the sense this is giving a very ingenious method to the promoters who with whom the IBC specifically wants to be thrown out. If I read section 29A, IBC does not want people who are responsible for all these disruptions in the working of the of a company to be in the management and control of the company. But now, if I read the limitation judgment, there are so many matters and so many cases practically which we are facing where the corporate debtor simply comes up and says, "Ki, look, your default is way back. So you cannot come before the IBC court." There is no clarity even whether my claim will be admitted by the RP also in some other court. Because in many companies, there is no balance sheet also. For last 5 years, 10 years, they are not even preparing balance sheets. So they'll say, no, there is no debt. There is nothing. Your debt is barred by limitation. This cannot be the idea of the code, because when the code came, it definitely wanted to give a right to the secured creditors. These are secured creditors. They have security interest. And one category of secured creditors is also an asset reconstruction company. So an asset reconstruction company takes over an NPA, or maybe 2-3 years after declaration of an NPA. That asset reconstruction company has a right to take SARFAESI action, has a right to file a SA, has a right to file an OA, everything, but has no right to file a proceeding under Section 7 of the code. So
Right.
this particular interpretation is not meeting the purpose of the code.
Right. So I will in fact want to ask Sachin sir, you've been advising both the debtors and of course the creditors on these issues. So with facing a limitation, it can be used as a sword and also as a shield. So how do you advise your clients, and what is your view whether this judgment, this interpretation should stand?
KPS, I think this interpretation is not a very good interpretation of or applicability of the Limitation Act on the IBC code. And Supreme Court, or a larger bench of Supreme Court, has to look at this issue, because what these judgments have said that IBC is not a, it's an application. It's not a suit. So Article 62 is applicable to suits, and so cannot be done to this. Now, if I as a financial creditor, I have a decree, and if it is not paid, so it is a continuing cause of action. Daily, there is a default. The non-payment of a decree is a default daily. So why does that not give me a limitation to file an IBC? Secondly, when these RDDBA Act and the SARFAESI Acts came into existence, the issue was same. RDDBA Act came in the 1990s. The SARFAESI Act came in the 2000. The financial creditors took actions of matters in which NPAs were done 10 years, 15 years earlier. So they were allowed. Even in the DRT Act, the filing that is done is called an original application. It's not a suit.
Right.
And the Act itself says CPC is not applicable to it. So why there a limitation on the Article 62 of 12 years is provided to a financial creditor, where there is a mortgage of assets, and not 137 or 3 years? So this aspect of these judgments have to be relooked by the Supreme Court, a larger bench of Supreme Court, and this question of law has to be relooked and decided, because this is going to affect a lot of financial creditors. And in fact, the asset reconstruction companies, as Varsha rightly said, would really go out of, they will not want to take, because, matters which have lesser value of assets or have difficulty in revival, because they buy NPAs. The date of NPAs could be older, and they may have no option of filing an IBC.
Correct. So I think this is your view that Supreme Court may have to take this to, may have to relook at it through a larger bench. But there are many judgments we have seen under IBC, and I think courts have been very supportive after the bill has come in, especially the Supreme Court. We have seen landmark judgments coming very frequently from Supreme Court on this, especially this code. Now, there's a recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the matter of JP Infratech, declaring mortgages created over the assets of a company for loan taken by the holding company as a preferential transaction. The Supreme Court has also realigned the definition of the term financial creditor in the said judgment. So I want Varsha, if you can, what's your take on this judgment? Do you think it is beneficial? Do you think that's the right approach?
So now, if we see the JP judgment, it has got two principal components. One is the criterions which are required to be established for a transaction to be considered as a preferential transaction. So while dealing with the definition of the term preferential transaction, the Supreme Court has actually explained the concept of a deeming fiction, which is a settled law. And thereafter, it has gone on to say that if the criterions, which is a preference of an antecedent debt, is met, then the transaction can be considered as a preferential transaction, and the transaction can be declared as null and void and accordingly reinstituted to the company. So that's one part of the definition of Section 43 and interpretation of Section 43, which is the purposive interpretation of Section 43 as laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court. The second aspect in the JP judgment is interestingly dealing with the definition of the term financial creditor. So for initiating any process under the code, it's very important that a creditor needs to be either a financial creditor or an operational creditor. Now, when we talk about a financial creditor, there were earlier judgments also in which the Supreme Court said who can be a financial creditor, specifically from the point of view of home buyers, as we know, starting from JP, then they had gone to Pioneer Urban, Bikram Chatterjee. They had discussed a lot about financial creditor. But in this matter, while dealing with the aspect of financial creditor, the Supreme Court has interestingly again laid emphasis on the term that the disbursement against consideration for time value of money is the key element. So the standalone provisions of Section 5.8, which talks about other aspects, guarantors, indemnity, any forward transactions and all, cannot be considered deholds the principal component of disbursement against consideration for time value of money. So when you link these terms of disbursement against consideration of time value of money, it will be interesting to see how the guarantors are placed as on date, how the other parties can now interpret this particular provision to say, look, it's not sufficient if I fall within any of the subcategories of Section 5.8, A to G. And the aspect of disbursement and that to the CD is critical, because in the matter of JP, the Honorable Supreme Court said that disbursement is definitely there, but disbursement is to the holding company. So if the disbursement is to the holding company, then the subsidiary company, as regards the subsidiary company, the test for disbursement is not met.
Okay.
So this will definitely come into the picture in very many cases where the corporate debtor can come up and say, look, there is no disbursement to me. So if there is no disbursement to me, how do you say that you're my ex?
Okay.
Mr.
That's
Kohli,
very
last 15 minutes, your time.
insightful. Yes, thank you. In fact, my next question is to Amir. And in fact, I want to switch gears, and we also got a soft nudge from Next Witness. So, Amir, what will be the effect of COVID-19 on the plans which are pending approval with the adjudicating authorities, I mean, the NCLTs? Will the resolution applicant honor their commitments or use force majeure or seek some suspension as regards the discharge of their obligations? How do you think the proceedings will be impacted?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, there are three scenarios. First scenario is when a RA is there who's contemplating to file a plan before the COC. Now, because of this thing, as this COVID situation, for sure they'll go back and think over it. Is it a viable option right now to invest in a distressed company? Second scenario is when a plan has already been filed before the COC, but COC is sitting on it for its approval. Over here, they're 100% going to go back to the COC and want to renegotiate the terms of the plan. Now, the tricky question is the third scenario, wherein a plan has already been approved by the COC, is pending before the Honorable Adjudicating Authority for its approval. Now, over here, we have seen a case last week in the case of Ramakrishna Forgings, that they want to go back to NCLT and want to renegotiate first with the COC and come back with a better plan. There's also another aspect to this, that there is no provision in the IBC that allows the resolution applicant to modify or withdraw a plan. But there was one case in the Honorable NCLT Bombay bench of SBI versus Metallics, wherein the members were of an opinion that IBC neither confers the power or jurisdiction on the authority to compel specific performance of the plan by an unwilling resolution applicant. Now, to answer the second part of your question, that what will happen, will the company go into liquidation or will they go back to the COC? The answer is quite simple, because if you see that in the case of the Amtech Auto, where the RA could not fulfill the stipulated obligations, the Honorable Supreme Court allowed for invitations from the COC, and RP was called on to give the expression of interest. So that can be a one scenario wherein obviously, we will have to see that IBC is promulgated only for the recovery, not for the recovery, only to see that the resolution plans are met, and the revival is the main aspect and not the liquidation.
Right. Now, that's a very interesting take on this. Now, there's one more question I have, and probably the last question before I take up the questions from the participants, and that's to Sachin sir, especially in view of Section 29A. Do you think that with COVID coming in, do you think that we need to relook 29A and probably allow the promoters to also now participate in the resolution process, because of course we do see that there will be a lot of impact on the economy. So what do you think?
Yes, I totally agree with the point of view that you have put, KP, that with this current situation, we may not have a lot of resolution applicants coming in and putting in their bids or proposals for takeover of companies. And even in the case of liquidation, we may not have buyers for the assets, because everyone has been affected. The cash flows of every company is affected. So they may not be wanting or in a position to today take over new entities, even if they're coming at a very reasonable pricing. So in that case, I think the government should relook at 29A and see if it can be tweaked in a way that the promoters get a chance to bid or give their proposals. And obviously, it is on the wisdom of the COC to approve a promoter's proposal or not. Now, in that also, they will have to safeguard, because the entire 29A cannot be tweaked, I think, but they will have to see whether they will not want the actual willful defaulters to come in with a plan who have siphoned off monies actually from the companies. But people whose companies have gone down or defaulted because of situations, other situations, market fall, product failure or things, could be given a chance to give a proposal to take their company back, pay off the creditors in a staggered amount. So I think these are is that in A and C, if it can be tweaked, which would basically help the pending matters of CIRP to have a resolution.
Right. Varsha, quickly, what's your take on this?
See, 29. So without 29A, also I think the promoters have a window, and which is 12A. So 12A scheme can be given right up to the time there is an approval of a resolution plan. So if the current market scenario or the economic situation warrants such a provision, I think so the creditors, if they are conscious, they can themselves have a 12A scheme with a promoter. So there is no bar as such, even till date, as far as the pending cases are concerned. But yes, maybe in certain situations, because it does not looks like that immediately we are going to have a 29A amendment, because the object clause of 29A was very different. There were a particular category of people who were supposed to be kept out of the process. So 12A, in my view, gives them a sufficient window for the pending schemes. And rest, this impact, this situation will be definitely there on the pending CIRPs, on the CIRPs which are there with an approved resolution plan, and also an implementation of a resolution plan. So some cooling off period might be required. So that we have to see.
Great. Thank you so much, panelists, for this. I myself have so many questions to ask, but I think there are many questions that we have received at the time of registration, and also participants are putting in their questions on the Q&A window. So I restrain myself, and as time is a constraint, we will take up few questions, but I will assure all my participants that that we will reply them to their questions by email after the session. So I will pick up one question that was asked, and probably any of the panelists who wants to take this up. Will the amendment will the amendment protect and sustain the matters for which CIRP has been initiated? Will there be any resolution applicant? I think they intend to say that amendment that they intend to bring in.
So I'll answer this question, because this is what I was saying just now. Is this thing ki, as far as the pending CIRPs are concerned, there is no clarity, because what is coming in the news and the cabinet note is only suspension of 7, 9 and 10. So 7, 9 and 10 have no bearing on a pending CIRP. So therefore, for the pending CIRP, the invitation of the resolution plans, the EOIs, need to be given some more time period. Obviously, this period of COVID is already stands excluded. That amendment is already there. So for none of the calculation purposes of a proceeding under the code, this entire period is going to be calculated. But still, looking into the general market sentiments, it might be feasible to have some cooling off period for these pending proceedings also, because it will be an uphill task for the resolution professional at this stage to identify buyers. Yes, promoters might have a chance, come up with a 12-way scheme, utilize the moment. Creditors may also consider approving of a 12-way scheme. So that's a window of a 12-way scheme. How do we balance it? 29A, other process, section 30 is something we have to see.
Okay. And my next question is to Amir, to what Amir has already mentioned in the webinar earlier. Do you think that what are the chances of reversal of CIRP proceedings under such unprecedented times? And if yes, at what stage of the CIRP is it likely to be reversed?
Yeah, so as rightly pointed out by Varsha ma'am, that 12A could be a standpoint of relief for all the CIRPs to be reversed. Now we have seen a katana of judgment at what stage it can be, and the regulations have also been amended. So if you see that it can be any stage where the financial creditor or the operational creditor either comes in terms with the corporate debtor, or the COC with 90% can vote it for the revival or the coming out from the CIRP process. Or there can also be avenues wherein 12A can be tweaked a little bit, wherein there can be clauses put that if this is the stage because of the COVID situation, because of this, if you have lost the substratum, then can it be a stage where the promoters or the existing management would be better placed to take the company out of this situation? Or should we go for a resolution applicant who might not be from the same industry or who might not be aware of the situation of the industry, may directly come and see this? So there is a likelihood of change in the 12A.
Right. There are a barrage of questions, and it's really difficult for me to pick a question. But I have one question for Sachin sir here, and the option available to the secured creditors as regards realizing their security interest outside the code as against relinquishment of securities and interest has resulted in a deadlock in various liquidation proceedings. So what is the best possible approach to balance the interest of the secured creditor and other stakeholders under the liquidation proceedings? And probably any other panelist who wants to take this up.
KP, this has been a situation in most of the pending liquidation matters. The liquidator has been writing to the secured creditors to relinquish their claim so he can sell the properties and resolve the matters and do recoveries for the creditors. But all the creditors don't relinquish their claim, and until all of them have relinquished, the liquidator does not have a right to auction the properties or take any of these steps under the Liquidation Act for realizing the assets of the company. Now, there has been a change in the regulation which says that if the liquidator writes to the financial creditor and if they don't reply in a month, it would be deemed that they have relinquished their right. So that regulation change has come, but that's okay. Let's see how that takes place. But in a lot of matters, some of the creditors are taking up the option of Section 52, staying outside the liquidation proceedings and taking up sale of the assets under SARFAESI or the SFA Act, or whichever is applicable to them.
Right.
Now, in those cases, in 2-3 cases, there have been judicial pronouncements by the NCLT and NCLAT, where it says that the first charge holder has the main right, and if he opts and says that he's going to not relinquish his security and stay outside liquidation,
yes,
then he has a right for the sale of the asset and recover its own dues, and after recovery of its dues, the amounts left will be paid to the other creditors.
right.
So the first charge holders, like I think other acts like the Companies Act, Section 529A, and others have been given preference under
Right.
the IBC also in proceedings where they stay outside the liquidation proceedings.
Right. Thank you. Now, quickly, one last question on how other countries are dealing with this pandemic, and probably 1 and 2 examples would be sufficient, and then we can reply by email.
Okay, I'll take this question. See, not many countries have made any amendment as such. There are very few countries which have come up with amendments. Either they have increased the limit, like how in India also the default limit has been increased. There's no special law which has been, enacted for amendment as such, except for some tweaking here and there. For example, Australia has increased the limit. Then we have, in Spain, where the compulsory filing is required, the grace period has been increased that they can file the petition, say, after 2 months or 3 months. So not many countries have done the needful in insolvency
Thank you.
as of now.
Thank you.
KP,
Thank you.
I'll just add.
Yes.
KP, I'll just add one line to this.
Yes.
I'll add to add what Ashish said. Most of the countries have that. It's necessary for their directors to themselves file insolvency once there is a default in the debt. And I think there are 20 or 22 countries all over the world who have given a moratorium on such kind of filings or have extended the periods of defaults so that insolvency would not have to be initiated against the companies.
With this, I thank you for the answer. And with this, I call this session closed. Thank you all, my panelists, for sharing their insights. And to the participants, as I've already mentioned, we will reply by email to all their queries.